The fire had eaten half the valley before dawn. Smoke rolled across Ember Creek like a living thing, choking the last of the cottonwoods. Ruth pulled her daughter through the heat, one hand shielding the child, the other clutching a bucket that was already half steam. The air roared. The world burned. Then she saw him. A figure crawling from the black earth, face raw, uniform in tatters. For a heartbeat, she thought it was her husband's ghost. Then the man reached toward her and whispered, "Don't let me die here." And Ruth did what no one else in town ever would. She dragged him out of the fire. The journey back to the cabin was a nightmare etched in shades of orange and black. He was a dead weight, unconscious, his body a map of pain. She hauled him with a strength born of pure, primal instinct, her lungs burning, her small daughter Anna clinging to her skirt and weeping silently. The world was a furnace, and this man was a coal she had pulled from its heart. She didn't know why. She only knew that his words, "Don't let me die here," had struck a chord deeper than her grief, deeper than her hatred. It was the plea of all of them, of everyone left in Ember Creek. "Don't let us die here." She got him inside, collapsing with him onto the rough-hewn floorboards as the firestorm roared past their small island, its terrible voice moving up the ridge. The cabin, miraculously, held. The wet burlap sacks stuffed in the door cracks sizzled and smoked, filling the single room with a sharp, acrid smell that mingled with the metallic tang of blood and burned flesh. Anna hid under the table, her small body shaking. Ruth just lay on the floor for a long moment, the man a dark, terrible heap beside her. She had saved him, and in that first moment of terrible, smoky silence, she was paralyzed by the magnitude of what she had done. This was not just a stranger. This was Eli, the ex-soldier, the dynamite man, the drifter who had been on the crew at the mine 2 years ago. The man the entire valley, in its unified, bottomless grief, had tried and convicted in their hearts. The man who had caused the explosion, the man who had killed her husband, Thomas. She stared at the soot-blackened, unconscious face of her enemy, and a cold dread, heavier than the smoke, settled over her. She had saved her husband's killer. What have I done? The question was a silent scream in the hot, dark room. When the smoke finally began to clear, it revealed a world scrubbed of color, a valley of charcoal and bone under a dull red sun. The silence of the graveyard that remained was absolute, broken only by the occasional crash of a destabilized, burned-out tree falling in the distant skeletal forest. Inside the cabin, the silence was just as heavy, but it was alive. It was the silence of a fever, of ragged breathing, of unspoken accusations. Ruth had moved the man to her husband's cot. The irony was so bitter it tasted like ash. For 3 days, Eli drifted in a fevered haze, a creature of smoke and mumbled apologies. "The fuse," he'd whisper, his voice a dry rasp, his hands clenching at the quilt. "Too short. God, it was too short. Tell them to run." Ruth tended to his burns with a terrible cold efficiency. She tore strips from her own spare linens, boiled water, and applied the harsh lye soap, her knuckles white as she scrubbed away the layers of soot and seared fabric. She worked in silence, her mind a warring territory. Every time she touched him, she saw Thomas's laughing face. She saw the mine entrance, the cloud of black smoke, the line of women waiting for news that would never come. She was tending the spark that had ignited her own personal hell. Anna, however, saw none of this. She would sit at a safe distance, her initial terror replaced by a child's profound curiosity. She saw only a man who was hurt. She would watch her mother's hands, their grim, determined movements. "Mama," she whispered on the 4th day, her voice small. "Is he a bad man?" Ruth stopped stirring the thin broth on the stove. She looked at the man, his face now clean but raw, a map of blisters and pain. "He's just a man, Anna. Right now, he's just a man who is hurt." Later that day, the fever broke. His eyes opened, and for the first time, they were clear. They were a startling pale gray, the color of the sky just before a snowstorm. He was weak, but he was aware. He looked at the rough-hewn ceiling, then at Anna, who quickly hid behind her mother's skirts. Then his gaze found Ruth. He stared at her for a long time, his expression unreadable, before a slow, dawning horror crept into his eyes. "Where?" "My cabin," Ruth said, her voice flat, devoid of pity. "Ember Creek." His eyes widened, just slightly. He knew. You're Thomas's wife." It wasn't a question. "I am," she said, her voice hard as iron. A different kind of heat flooded her memory. It wasn't the roaring, open heat of the wildfire. It was the damp, subterranean heat of the mine. She was standing at the entrance, the air thick with coal dust, waiting for Thomas's shift to end. Then, the sound. Not a loud explosion, but a deep, hollow thump, like the earth itself had choked. It was the silence after that broke her. A silence so total, so absolute, that it swallowed the screams of the women beside her. She had stood there for a night and a day, her body turning to stone, until they brought up his hat, the one she had mended that very morning. This man on her cot. He was the man who had lit that silence, and she realized with a cold, terrifying clarity that she had never truly left that mine entrance. A part of her was still standing there, waiting. Eli tried to sit up, a grimace of pure agony seizing him, but he fell back, turning his face to the wall. He didn't deny it. He didn't offer excuses. A long, terrible silence filled the room, broken only by the man's ragged, painful breathing. Finally, he spoke, his voice so quiet she almost missed it. "You should have left me." Ruth stopped her work. She turned to face him, the bowl of broth in her hand. "I almost did." He nodded, accepting this as his due. "It was a bad fuse," he whispered, so quietly she wondered if he was speaking to her or to the ghosts. "I told them. The foreman. He said we were behind. I should have cut the main line. I should have stopped him. I didn't." He was not a monster. He was just a weak man, and in the West, a weak man's mistake could have the force of a landslide. Ruth felt something unwelcome and sharp pierce her anger, a sliver of understanding. It was, in its own way, more painful than the hate. He tried to leave. On the 7th day, he managed to stand, his legs trembling, his body wrapped in her spare quilt. He stumbled to the door. I can't be here. It ain't right. I'll go." Ruth blocked his path. The air outside was still acrid, the ground a gray wasteland. "You won't last a day. You'll die out there." "Maybe I should," he breathed, his gray eyes meeting hers. In them she saw no malice, no evil. She saw only a profound, bottomless exhaustion. "Maybe," she replied, her voice hard. "But my daughter watched me pull you from that fire. She will not watch me send you out to die from the cold. Not yet. You'll heal. You'll eat my food and you'll mend. And then you'll go." It was a truce, not a peace, a stay of execution. And so the days blurred into weeks. What began as endurance slowly became a rhythm. The land, like the man, began to heal in slow, agonizing increments. After a week, the first green shoots of fireweed pushed up through the ash, a violent, defiant purple against the gray. It was a stubborn, desperate kind of beauty. Eli, too, regained his strength, and with strength came the need to do. He couldn't bear the weight of her charity, the suffocating presence of her unspoken grief. He was a ghost at her table, eating her food, sleeping in her husband's cot, the roof of the woman whose life he had detonated. One morning, Ruth woke to the sound of a hammer. She ran outside, her heart pounding, thinking a neighbor had finally come, or worse, that the cabin was unstable. But it was Eli. He was at the edge of her property, mending the section of fence the fire had consumed. He was clumsy, his bandaged hands struggling with the tools, his weak legs trembling. But he was working. He had salvaged half-burned timbers from the creek bed and was, piece by piece, rebuilding the barrier that kept her safe. She watched him for a long time. He didn't look up, as if he could feel her gaze and was ashamed to meet it. He was rebuilding the wall, but he was the one who had shattered her world. The irony was so thick, she felt she could choke on it. She said nothing and went back inside to make coffee, but she left a cup for him on the porch rail. This became their new language. Words were too dangerous, too laden with the ghosts of the mine. So they spoke in actions. He resplit the woodpile, his movements slow and pained. He patched the leak in the roof where a burning branch had fallen. He whittled a small new leg for the table that had always wobbled, his knife moving with a surprising practiced grace. And Ruth, in turn, would leave a bowl of stew, a fresh bandage, a cup of water without comment. They were two survivors, circling each other in a world of ash, bound by an act of mercy that neither of them fully understood. The true bridge, however, was Anna. She was the only one in that house without a past to protect. To her, Eli was not the dynamite man, the town pariah. He was simply Eli. He was the quiet man with the sad eyes who had come out of the fire. One afternoon, she approached him while he sat on the porch, staring at the scarred hills. She held out her small wooden doll, the one her father had made. Its arm had been singed in the cellar. "Can you fix her?" Anna asked. Eli looked from the doll to the child, his expression unreadable. He hesitated, as if afraid his touch would taint it, would somehow transfer his own guilt to this last, precious piece of her father. But he took it gently from her. He spent the rest of the day with his small pocket knife, not just fixing the arm, but carving tiny, intricate flowers into the wood, covering the scorch mark with something new, something beautiful. When he gave it back to her, Anna beamed. Then she did something that shattered the cabin's fragile peace. She threw her small arms around his neck and hugged him. Ruth, watching from the window, felt her breath catch. Eli went rigid, his hands hovering in the air, terrified to return the embrace. He looked at Ruth over Anna's head, his eyes wide with a kind of panic, as if asking for permission or begging for forgiveness. But Anna just held on. Slowly, hesitantly, Eli's scarred hands came to rest on her back. That evening, the calm settled. The earned softness had arrived. Anna, emboldened, dug into Eli's scorched rucksack, which Ruth had salvaged. She pulled out a small blackened harmonica. "Can you?" she asked, holding it up. Eli looked at Ruth, as if for permission. Ruth just nodded, turning back to her mending. He wiped it clean on his shirt and put it to his lips. He played a simple tune. It wasn't a cowboy song or a hymn. It was a melody that sounded like the land itself, lonesome, a little broken, but yearning. It was the sound of the gray hills, of the stubborn fireweed, of the long silence after a tragedy. Anna sat at his feet, mesmerized. Ruth stopped her sewing, her needle poised in midair. The music didn't erase the past. It didn't fix the unfixable. But for a moment, it wove the three of them together in a shared, quiet present. She saw him not as the man who had taken her husband, but as a man who had lost himself. And she realized, with a shock that stole her breath, that she was no longer afraid of him. The days grew shorter, the nights cooler. The valley floor was now carpeted in a surprising, vibrant green. The fire, having cleared the underbrush, had given way to a surge of new life. The healing of the land had begun, and with it, the healing of the small, broken family in the cabin. Eli's work expanded. He wasn't just mending, he was building. He cleared a patch of scorched earth near the creek and began to turn the soil for a late-season garden, mixing the ash into the dirt to enrich it. Anna followed him like a shadow, carrying seeds he'd found in a salvaged tin. One afternoon, Ruth watched from the porch as he taught Anna how to carve. He had a piece of soft cottonwood, and with his knife, he was showing her how to make a small bird. His large, scarred hands were surprisingly gentle, guiding her small ones. "You don't force the wood," he was saying, his voice a low rumble. You listen to it. You see where it wants to go. You just help it get there." Anna, her tongue stuck out in concentration, managed to shave off a perfect curl of wood. She laughed, a bright, clear sound that hadn't been heard in this valley for 2 years. Ruth felt a sharp, complicated pang in her chest. It was a feeling so tangled with guilt and tenderness that it almost stole her breath. That was how Thomas had taught Anna. His hands had been just as gentle. She was watching another man sit in her husband's place, and instead of the rage she expected, she felt a dangerous, unwelcome warmth. Her daughter was laughing. The sound was worth the sin, whatever it was. That evening, the silence in the cabin was no longer tense. It was comfortable. Anna was asleep, her newly carved bird clutched in her hand. Eli sat on the porch, staring out at the valley, now bathed in the cool silver light of a full moon. Ruth came out and sat in the other chair, her mending in her lap. "She hasn't laughed like that," Ruth said quietly, "since before the mine." Eli didn't look at her. He just nodded, his knuckles white as he gripped the porch rail. "She's a good girl. She reminds me of my sister. Before." "Before?" Ruth asked, her needle stopping. Eli was silent for a long time, the only sound the chirping of the crickets in the new grass. "Before the war. Before all of it. I was the oldest. I was supposed to protect them." He paused, his voice growing rough. "In the war, you do things, you see things, you run. You run and you live, and they call you a hero because you brought back the flag or a message. You run and you live." He turned to look at her, his gray eyes full of a pain that went far beyond the mine. Then you're in a hole in the ground, and the air is bad, and you run again. Only this time, you're not a hero. You're a coward. I'm still trying to tell the difference, Ruth. I'm just so tired of running." He had confessed. Not just his guilt, but his trauma. He had given her the broken pieces of himself. Ruth didn't say anything. She just sat with him, in the quiet, in the moonlight. She reached out, her hand hovering, and then, slowly, she placed it over his on the railing. His hand was scarred and calloused, but it was warm. He didn't pull away. They just sat, two survivors, watching the broken land heal. But the valley had a long memory. The town of Ember Creek, nestled in the lower canyon, had not forgotten the fire, and it had certainly not forgotten the mine. It was a town built on coal and sustained by grief. Ruth, forced by dwindling supplies of flour and salt, finally had to ride her mule into town. She left Eli and Anna at the cabin, a knot of dread in her stomach. She hadn't spoken to anyone but them in weeks. The town was quiet. Mr. Henderson, the blacksmith, was shoeing a horse. He had lost his brother Ben in the mine. He was a large man, his face perpetually smudged with soot, his grief as silent and heavy as his anvil. He saw her and just nodded. "Ruth." "Mr. Henderson," she replied, her voice tight. "Fire. It don't care who it takes," he grunted, not looking up from the hoof. "Just glad it spared you and the girl. You need anything." The stovepipe looked bent from the ridge. "Thank you, Samuel," she said, touched by the gruff, buried kindness. We're mending. It was a small grace, but it wasn't the town. The true test was Mrs. Gable. She, like Ruth, was a widow of the mine. Her son, barely 18, had been on Thomas's crew. She was a woman who wore her grief like armor, and she saw sin in everything. She was coming out of the general store as Ruth was tying up her mule. Her eyes narrowed. "Ruth, we haven't seen you at prayer. The pastor's been concerned." "I've been busy, Mrs. Gable. Rebuilding," Ruth said. "Rebuilding." Mrs. Gable's voice was thin. "We all have to rebuild, but some forget what was torn down." She looked past Ruth, up toward the ridge where her cabin stood, a small, dark shape against the sky. "You're isolated up there. It's not good, especially for the girl." It was a warning. A chill ran down Ruth's spine. She got her supplies, her head down, the weight of the town's judgment heavy on her shoulders. She hurried back, the small kindness from the blacksmith overshadowed by the cold suspicion of the widow. The true betrayal came a week later. Mrs. Gable, ostensibly on a mission of Christian charity, rode up to the cabin. She carried a basket with a small pie. Ruth's heart sank. She met her on the porch. "Mrs. Gable, you shouldn't have. It's the least I can do for a sister in mourning," she said, her eyes scanning the property. And then she saw him. Eli had come around the side of the cabin, carrying a newly mended axe. He and Mrs. Gable froze. He saw the basket, the black dress, the horrified recognition in her eyes. She saw the killer. Mrs. Gable's hand flew to her mouth, the basket dropping from her arm. The pie tin clattered on the porch, spilling its contents. "You," she whispered, her face pale. "It's him, the murderer. Mrs. Gable, please." Ruth started. "He's here?" she shrieked, stumbling back. In Thomas's home? With his child? Ruth, what have you done?" She didn't wait for an answer. She scrambled onto her mule, her face a mask of pale, horrified outrage, and galloped down the path as if fleeing the devil himself. "Eli," Ruth breathed, her hand on the doorframe. "I should go," he said, his voice flat. "I should have gone. I'm bringing this on you." "No," Ruth said, her voice shaking but firm. It's just talk. She's grieving." "It's not just talk, Ruth. You know it. That's Pastor Hale's right hand. By sundown. The whole town will know." He looked at her, his face etched with a familiar, weary pain. Don't lose your daughter for me." "We," Ruth said, grabbing his arm, her grip fierce. "We will face this. Not you, not me. We." He was right. The next time Ruth went to town, the air had changed. The chill was no longer suspicion. It was ice. Mr. Henderson wouldn't meet her eye. The storekeep served her in silence, his back to her as much as possible, and in the corner she saw them, Mrs. Gable, 2 other widows, and Pastor Hale. Their heads were bent together, a dark knot of judgment. When they saw her, they didn't stop. They just stared, their whispers ceasing, their silence a condemnation. She fled back to the cabin, the isolation now complete. They were no longer just survivors. They were outcasts. The pastor did not wait long. He arrived 2 days later, not with the quiet deacons, but with a small, angry crowd. Mrs. Gable was at his side, her face set. Mr. Henderson was there too, hanging back, his face a mask of conflict. Pastor Hale stood on her porch, his Bible clutched in one hand, like a weapon. "Ruth," he said, his voice a cold boom, "the town knows. They know you have brought this killer into your home, into the home of Thomas's child." Eli stepped out of the cabin, his face pale but resolved. He stood beside Ruth. "This is on me, Pastor. I'll leave. You have my word. I'll be gone by dusk." "Leave?" Hale gave a hollow, mirthless laugh. "It's too late for that, son. The sin is in the house. The rot has set in." He turned his burning gaze on Ruth. He has poisoned you. And you have poisoned the memory of your husband. He has done nothing but good here, Ruth said, her voice shaking. He has mended. He has worked. He is a good man. A good man? Hale sneered. The Bible tells us an eye for an eye. This man's debt is paid in blood, and he has hidden here, in the shadow of his victim's wife. And the Bible also says, "Let he who is without sin cast the first stone." Ruth shot back, her fear crystallizing into anger. This town is sick with grief, Pastor, and you are using it like a poison. You fan the flames of hatred when you should be bringing water. I am bringing righteousness, Hale roared, and I am here to save a child. He took a step closer, his shadow falling over Ruth. The town council has met. They are concerned, deeply concerned, for Anna's welfare, living under the roof of a killer, a man of violence and proven cowardice. It is not a fit or moral home for a child. The circuit judge arrives in a week. We will have a petition signed by every family in this valley. He lowered his voice, the threat becoming intimate, deadly. You will be alone, Ruth, and she will be a ward of the church. At that moment, Anna, who had been hiding inside, heard the word church and take. She ran out, terrified, and did the one thing that sealed their fate. She didn't run to Ruth. She ran to Eli, burying her face in his legs, clutching him for protection. Pastor Hale's face went white with fury. It was an image of blasphemy. You see? The child is corrupted. He has bewitched you both. No, Eli said, his voice ragged, his hands resting on Anna's head. You won't. You can't. Let me go. Tell them you cast me out. Tell them I threatened you. Whatever it takes. Don't lose her. Not for me. Ruth looked at Eli, his face a mask of terror, willing to be sacrificed. She looked at Hale, his face rigid with certainty. She looked at Henderson, who was watching Anna, his expression unreadable. I will not, Ruth said. Her voice was quiet, but it cut through the pastor's rhetoric. What did you say, woman? I said no. Ruth stepped forward, pulling Anna to her side, but keeping her hand on Eli's arm. You will not take my daughter, and you will not use her to force my hand. I am choosing my child, and I will not teach her to confuse vengeance with justice. I will not teach her that mercy is a sin. She turned to the crowd. The annual Ember Creek Fair is tomorrow. You all want to judge? You all want to cast a stone? Then do it. Do it in the light, in front of God and everyone. We will be there, and you can tell us, to our faces, that we are not fit to live. Hale was stunned. He had expected a tearful, repentant widow. He found a lioness. He stammered, then collected himself. So be it. Tomorrow, then. Before the entire valley, we will see what the community decides is just. He turned, his black coat swirling, and led his procession of judges away. The morning of the fair, the cabin was silent. Eli sat at the table, his head in his hands. He was wearing a clean, mended shirt, Thomas's shirt. Ruth had mended it for him. He looked up as she and Anna got ready. Ruth, there's still time. I can be gone. Over the ridge. They'll never find me. You can tell them you sent me away. And what would that teach her? Ruth said, braiding Anna's hair, her knuckles white. To run? To lie? To let the loudest voice win? No, we will stand. Together. Anna, sensing the terrible adult weight in the room, walked over to Eli. She silently pushed the small, blackened harmonica into his hand. He looked at it, then at her. He closed his hand around it, the metal cool against his palm. It was his armor. He nodded and stood up. The walk into town was an ordeal. The air was still, heavy, and smelled of the lingering ash. As they approached the main street, the low murmur of the crowd died. A wave of silence rolled through the townsfolk. People parted for them as if they carried a disease. Mrs. Gable stood near the front, her arms crossed, her face a mask of judgment. Ruth saw Mr. Henderson by his stall, his hammer silent. He watched them, his face pained. Pastor Hale stood on the small wooden gazebo that served as the town's stage, his Bible already open. He saw them approach, and a thin, satisfied smile touched his lips. This was his arena. "Friends, neighbors!" his voice boomed. "We gather today to celebrate our survival, to celebrate the resilience of Ember Creek. The fire tested us, but it did not break us." A few half-hearted amens rose from the crowd. "But a fire," Hale continued, his voice dropping, "is not the only test. A spiritual sickness can be worse than any flame. It can rot from within. We are faced today with a wound in our very heart, a wound that has been coddled, kept open, defended." His eyes found Ruth. "We are a town of widows, of orphans, and we are asked to break bread with the very man who brought this upon us." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. "Shame!" someone shouted from the back. "He should have hung!" yelled another. Ruth watched as the communal grief she knew so well was twisted, sharpened into a weapon by Hale's righteous hands. Eli stood beside her, his body tense, absorbing every word like a blow, his face a mask of shame, his hand clutching the harmonica in his pocket. Hale raised his hand for silence. "I have pleaded with the widow Ruth. I have begged her to cleanse her home, to think of her child. But she has chosen differently. She has chosen the company of the guilty over the comfort of her community." He pointed a long, bony finger, a prophet condemning a witch. "Ruth, I ask you one last time, before God and this town, renounce this man, send him out, cleanse your home and save your child." The silence was absolute. Every eye in Ember Creek was on her. This was the moment, the public reversal. The town square was a courtroom, and she was on trial for the crime of compassion. Ruth let go of Anna's hand. She gave Eli a look, not of fear, but of resolve. She walked the few steps to the gazebo and stood beside the pastor, facing the people she had known her entire life. "I am a widow of this town," she began, her voice not loud but clear, carrying in the still, hot air. "I have mourned with you. I have buried my husband alongside yours. My grief is as real as yours. My anger was as real as yours. When I found this man in the ash, my first thought was to let him die, to let the fire finish what the town wanted finished. I wished him dead." Eli closed his eyes. "But I didn't. My daughter was watching, and I pulled him out. I did not take in a monster, Pastor Hale. I took in a man, and I listened, and I learned the truth. He is guilty, yes. He is guilty of running. He is guilty of surviving when better men did not. And he is living in a hell of his own making, a hell of shame, every single day. He has lived under my roof. He has eaten my bread, and he has done nothing but try to repay a debt we all know he cannot. He mended my fence. He patched my roof. He carved a toy for my daughter." She turned to the crowd, her voice softening, pleading. "Look at us. This valley is covered in ash. We have all been burned. By the mine, by the fire, by grief. And we stand here judging a man for surviving his own fire when we are all just trying to survive ours. This town is not dying from the fire, Pastor Hale. It is dying from this. This hatred. This poison of an eye for an eye that will leave us all blind, wandering in the dark." She stepped forward, her eyes locked on the crowd. "We are all just survivors, and no one who survives a fire deserves to be ashamed to live in the light. I will not cast him out. I will not teach my daughter that compassion is a sin. If you want to cast out the sinner, then you will have to cast me out too, and you will have to cast out my child, because we are done living in the ash." A stunned, profound silence fell over the square. Pastor Hale was speechless, his mouth open, his judgment stolen from him. The crowd was frozen, caught between their long-held rage and the undeniable, painful truth of her words. In that silence, Mr. Henderson, the blacksmith, looked at Mrs. Gable and then at Ruth. He didn't speak, but he took his hat off, a slow, respectful gesture. It was a tiny crack in the mob's unity. And into that silence, a new sound. A single, soft pat on the dusty ground, then another, and another. A woman in the front row looked up, her hand outstretched. A drop of rain, then two. The sky, which had been a merciless brassy dome for months, was darkening. A cool wind, the first in memory, swept through the street, carrying not smoke, but the sweet electric smell of ozone. The heavens opened. It wasn't a drizzle. It was a deluge. The first rain since the fire. It streamed down, turning the dust to mud, washing the soot from the air, from the rooftops, from the stunned faces of the townsfolk. People stood motionless, letting the cold, clean water soak them to the bone. It was a baptism, a cleansing, an absolution. Pastor Hale, his fire and brimstone rendered meaningless by this sudden holy water, wilted. He closed his Bible, his face a mask of defeat, and walked off the stage, a man defeated not by argument, but by grace. People began to disperse, not in anger, but in a quiet, contemplative daze. They moved toward their homes, heads bowed as if waking from a long, terrible dream. Ruth remained on the stage, the rain plastering her hair to her face, tears mixing with the downpour. Eli walked up the steps and stood before her, his own face washed clean of soot and shame. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. He just looked at her, his gray eyes full of a lifetime of pain and gratitude. Anna ran up and grabbed both their hands. The three of them stood there, a strange, broken, and redeemed trio, as the rain fell on Ember Creek. The rain lasted for 3 days, a steady, soaking, forgiving sound. It washed the last of the ash from the trees, and the creek, which had been a dry, scorched wound, began to run again, clear and cold. The valley, which had been black and gray, was now a deep, rich brown, poised for rebirth. The silence from the town remained, but it was no longer hostile. It was thoughtful. A week later, Ruth was hanging laundry in the clean, sharp air when she saw a wagon approaching. It was Mr. Henderson. He pulled up, not getting down. Eli, who had been turning soil in the new garden plot, stopped, his shovel in his hand. The blacksmith cleared his throat. He reached into the back of his wagon and pulled out a heavy, newly forged iron hinge for her gate, which had been damaged in the fire. Gate was looking weak, he grumbled, not meeting her eyes. Figured it might not hold the winter. He handed it to Eli. Their hands brushed. It was an offering, a peace. "Thank you, Samuel," Ruth said, her voice soft. Henderson just nodded, his face still conflicted, but the hardness was gone. "My Ben, he liked Thomas, and he never held with that foreman, just so you know." He turned his wagon around and rumbled away. Life returned. Eli worked the land, planting the late-season crops, his movements no longer those of a temporary guest, but of a man building a home. Anna, her laughter now a regular sound, ran through the new, muddy yard, her carved bird in her hand. That evening, Ruth sat on the porch, watching the sun set. The sky was no longer red with smoke. It was a deep, healing purple. Eli came and sat beside her, not in the other chair, but on the step below, leaning back against the post. He took out the harmonica, wiped it clean, and began to play. It was the same lonesome, yearning tune, but it wasn't lonesome anymore. It was a song of belonging. Ruth looked out at the valley, at the first tentative stars. She looked at the man on her porch, and the child sleeping peacefully inside. The past was not gone. The ghosts of the mine would always be there, but they were no longer an inferno. They were embers, and embers, she knew, were just a different kind of warmth. They had walked through fire, but somehow they still stood together.